701 class, how are you? I just wanted to introduce myself so you have a face to the name also. And I just wanted to overview what your assignment is today. So my name is Gina Riley. I'll be your professor for the course. So I just wanted to go through the notes that I gave you on chapters 1 and 2. And remember, in terms of StrengthsFinder, that you want to start reading StrengthsFinder now. The assignment doesn't come until later on, but you definitely want to at least get the book and then start it. So note that, testing is always just a tool. I don't want you to see testing as this big, huge thing. Testing is a tool to measure students' strengths and weaknesses. So that's really important to remember. Also, in terms of testing and assessment, it's always has to be holistic and whole child based. So you're not just testing one aspect of the child, you're testing a lot of aspects of the child in different ways, and you're not using the same tests all of the time. In terms of qualitative and quantitative assessment, that's something that you have to know right now. So when we're talking about qualitative assessment, we're talking about interviews, observations, and tests that contain those. When you're talking about quantitative assessment, that's more data-driven and numbers-based. So just remember, qual, QUAL, interviews, observations, quantitative, QUANT, more data, numbers-based. And I think that's really important. We'll talk about, and you'll see, because I'll make videos, we'll talk about all different types of tests and assessments in this class. But I just want to get you an idea about what types of tests and assessments are used for what. So when we're talking about intellectual disability, again, know those 13 IDEA classifications. If you're taking 700, you're learning them now, but do get familiar with those. So if you're talking about intellectual disability, the tests and assessments used are qualitative and quantitative. So of course IQ test is used just to get a measure of IQ. Now remember, IQ, yes, it's very, very important when you talk about the determination of intellectual disability, but it's not the most important thing, okay? Because you're also looking at measures of self-care. So when you're testing a student with possible intellectual disability, you're looking at IQ, and that comes from stuff like the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, or the WISC, and you're looking at maybe a measure of self-care like the Vineland self-care measure. Okay, you're also really looking at qualitative factors. So you're looking at interviews with people who know the child, you're looking at physicians' records, you're looking at a lot of things, especially for an eligibility that's as serious as intellectual disability. When you're talking about LD, you want to get an IQ score, again, using the WISC or some other intelligence test for a rule out for ID. And then you also want to get achievement test measures, as well as qualitative and quantitative assessment of the child. So you're looking at teacher records. If you're a teacher, you're looking at the stuff you do. And that's so important. Again, assessment's always holistic. You're not just using one test to assess or evaluate. In terms of emotional and behavioral disorder, this will probably be our funnest lecture lesson. I'll be holding up lots of pictures and saying, hey, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? In terms of emotional and behavioral disorder, emotional and behavioral disorder assessment is a subjective process. So I want you to remember that. It's subjective because it really depends on psychiatrist, psychologist involved. I wish it was more objective. I'm a psychologist myself. But again, it's not like a medical diagnosis. There's no blood tests. So it is subjective, but we use a lot of tests. IQ is sometimes used as a rule-out measure. We're also using more subjective type tests like projective testing. If you've ever heard of the Rorschach or the CAT or the TAT, the Rotter Incomplete Sentence Scale, all those are used to test for EBD, as well as, again, that qualitative, quantitative mix. Then you have autism. So autism, again, you're going to do a lot of qualitative, a lot of interviews, observations, and then you have different scales that diagnose or help to diagnose, because not one test diagnoses, but helps to diagnose autism. So you have a scale like the CHAT, the checklist for autism in toddlers, when you're talking about infantile autism. Again, this is just to get you like into assessment and testing. We're going to talk about all these tests in depth later on. When you're talking about speech language issues, I always say, like, make sure that there is a report by the speech language pathologist. You should never have a child with a speech language disorder that hasn't been tested or assessed by a speech language pathologist. So that's something to think about as you think about IEPs. When we're talking about diagnoses like ADD or ADHD, remember it's not a disability under the 13. That goes under OHI, or other health impaired. This is also, though, a diagnosis that's qualitatively and quantitatively tested, holistic. So you're talking about looking at teacher records, looking at parent records, but you're also talking about doing things like the Connor scale or another rating scale. So that's just a summary of what types of tests or assessments we might talk about in class, and stuff that I'm excited to talk about. If you're taking 700 now, do really take a look at that evaluative part of 701. What happens when a parent or someone else asks for an evaluation of their child? Remember, no evaluation is done unless the parent signs for it. But you want to know how that goes. And so our readings cover that, as well as SPED 700 if you've already taken it. In terms of law and ethics, we're going to go deep into the issue of culture and testing. And I want to go deep into the issue of culture and testing because I don't think it's talked about enough. And it's something that I'm really passionate about. When we go deep and while we go deep, I also want you to know that there's a lot of talk about bias and testing, and it's a very valid discussion. But also that no test is ever going to be perfect. So as much as those testers work on testing, no test is ever going to be perfect. There's never going to be 100% valid, reliable, unculturally biased testing tool. So just know that when you're having that discussion about culture in your head, there's no perfect test, but we're always trying to do better. You know, you have to understand that there's a process to test creation. And we'll talk about that process. Now, the great thing about in this class is we get to talk about that process from A to Z. And think about how you guys, if you're teaching, create tests. Are you content valid? So do you only test students on the content? Do you not grade for handwriting? Do you not grade for any sort of other writing? Are you only testing students on content? Are you always reliable? Are you always consistent in terms of rating and score? These are all things we're going to talk about in this class. I also want you to realize that in terms of ethics, so you have IDEA, and you should know IDEA. And if you don't know IDEA, read up in that chapter 1 in your friend textbook in 700. If you've been teaching for a while and you're familiar with IDEA, fantastic. Again, note that parental consent is super important. You are not doing any evaluation, or no one is doing any evaluation without parental consent. And sometimes, day 1 of you get that signature, it takes a month or 2 to go from signature to full evaluation. I'm always like, oh, that's a long time, but you want to do this right, especially if it's an initial evaluation. You want to do these evaluative things correctly, and you want to get the best information to make an eligibility determination. So that's something I'm passionate about. In terms of parent consent, parents could always understand what they're consenting to. So if a parent speaks another language, the actual consent form and everything they're consenting to should be available in their native language. Someone should be explaining in simple terms what all this means. I think a lot of parents come into IEP meetings, or a lot of parents come into schools very confused as to what's happening. It should be very, very clear to parent or guardian what's happening when their child does get an evaluation. You know, in terms of IDEA, also non-discriminatory assessment is so important, and that has a couple of parts. A, it's mandated by law. It ensures fairness and objectivity in testing, so that's super important. B, the instruments used should not be racially, ethnically, spiritually, or culturally biased. C, mode of communication used by the student has to be within the assessment process. So if you have an initial student coming in that's an ELL, I'm so very passionate about this. I do not want this child tested in English if English is not his or her native language. If you have a student coming in new from another country, I want them tested in their native language. New York City Board of Education has a ton of bilingual and trilingual psychologists available to do this. It's one phone call. So I am so very passionate about students being tested in their native language. That's so very important to me. And again, one phone call is effort, and it takes effort, but that's how you ensure non-discriminatory assessment. It's like, what if I told you your final exam was in Russian and you're not a native Russian speaker? That would be an issue. You'd give me a hard time. Same thing with any student coming into schools. I want them to be fairly assessed. And the only way they can be fairly assessed, especially if they're coming in as an L, is if testing and assessment is in their native language. Also, assessments given should be whole child based, holistic. You're not just giving one assessment for one thing, you're looking at the whole entire child. Both qualitative and quantitative assessments, totally, again, focused on the whole child. And also, assessment should be psychometrically accurate. So that means high reliability, high validity, and reliability and validity is going to be something that we talk about in this course a lot. And I'm glad it's super important, and you'll understand numbers by the time you get out of this course. You'll understand correlation coefficients, and you're going to understand, like, hey, when you read that test protocol, is this a valid and reliable test? Is it not a valid and reliable test? And we'll talk about pros and cons. Again, there's always like testing protocol, and there's a standardized directive, and that's so important to use. But it's also important to look at the child in front of you, or to look at the teen in front of you. Now, of course, you're teachers. You're not going to be doing a lot of the formal testing and assessment, but know that school psychologists and psychologists know this also. People who are going to do the most formal testing and assessment are going to be the psychologists, the school psychologists, and the psychiatrists. So note that they know, they have a code of ethics. NASP has a code of ethics. APA, American Psychological Association, has a code of ethics. They know to follow these ethics. I teach these budding psychologists, and they know that this is so important. But note that also as a teacher, think of the way you assess, and think about, do I assess in the most ethical fashion? Do I test in the most ethical way? This is pertinent to our field. It's pertinent to our culture. We're going to talk at the very end of our class about transition, and this is a passion because my focus is on adolescent special education. And when we talk about transition, we're going to talk about the different tests and assessments used to ensure a proper transition. And when I'm talking about transition, again, go back to 700, or if you haven't taken it, you probably don't know. When I'm talking about transition, I'm talking about students age 14 or older who are going to become adults and age out of the system or IDEA and go on to ADA. So transition is a really important time where we assess strengths and needs and weaknesses and all of those things in order for this person to go from the school to be a healthy, functioning adult with or without disabilities. For me, I'm passionate about the topic. I'm so excited I get to share it with you. I'll try to do a video every week. Some weeks don't need a video, so I won't, but I thought I'd show my face. And other weeks are gonna need video because we're gonna talk about tests, and I'm gonna show you tests, and we're gonna have fun with tests, because I think part of learning is play. And it's so important for you to see what I'm talking about and see what we're using. So we'll do videos for things like IQ tests and projective tests. Note, I'm also always available in person, via email, phone, text. Don't hesitate to call me. Don't hesitate to contact me. Don't hesitate to email me. Come visit me in 1104 West. My office hours are on Thursdays from 2 to 6, although I'm there pretty much a lot of the time. And so if you want to make an appointment, call and make an appointment. And we can play with tests in person or do whatever you need to do. Again, clarity here is important, so I always want you to know what to expect. So if you don't know what to expect, or if you're not understanding something I'm saying, I'm trying to fit this all into a 15-minute video, do feel free to call, email, contact me. All right, you guys, I'll see you next week. Thanks for listening. Bye.